Welcome to Ross Night, hosted by the Asia Pacific Youth Association with our co-organizers Charlie Video and the Formosa Correspondence Club. Today, we're going to once again look at global issues from a Taiwan perspective. I'm your host, Ross Feingold, and our very special guest is Chase Harrison, editorial associate at the America Society, Council of the Americas. Chase, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. Good morning here from New York. Good evening to you all.
Well, before we talk about the recent Nicaragua election and the upcoming Honduras election, tell us a bit about your background.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm an editorial associate at the America Society Council of the Americas, which is a policy forum business organization based here in New York with offices in DC and Miami. Before that, I received a master's degree in comparative politics from Oxford, where I focused on Central America and Mexico. And I've done a lot of travel and risk consulting work in Mexico and Central America.
How did you become interested in Mexico, Central or South America?
It started with my father, who worked a lot in the region when I was growing up, and I would accompany him on business trips. And then it really developed actually when I was in high school speech and debate. I loved speaking about Latin America. It's a country rich in culture with some very colorful politics. And then that turned into focusing on it in college and eventually ending up at the Council of the Americas.
Now, you don't have to be modest. Are you fluent in Spanish?
I am fluent in Spanish, and I can get by in Portuguese.
Yeah, did you become fluent in Spanish just from the trips when you were a kid and personal interest, or a lot of class study as well?
It was a combination of them all. I've been taking Spanish since elementary school, but the instruction has paled in comparison to what I've learned in the region. Absolutely.
Council of the Americas and the America Society does?
Sure. It's an interesting organization with this funny dual-headed name. We were founded by David Rockefeller to unite the Western Hemisphere and to specifically strengthen ties between the United States and Latin America. And we do that through our two organizations. So the America Society is really more focused on arts and music. So this notion that to unify a hemisphere, you need to have these strong cultural ties. And then the Council of the Americas focuses more on business, economics, and politics. So we have member companies, and we help them understand and navigate the region, as well as doing a lot of public programming and writing through both our website, and we have a magazine called America's Quarterly, where we write about hemispheric issues.
What are some of the issues that you've written about recently?
You know, I've done a lot of writing on coronavirus. Latin America was the region hardest hit by coronavirus, but the vaccination campaign, thankfully, is actually going well in Latin America. They're nearing regionally almost 50% coverage. So I do a lot of writing about various facets of vaccine rollouts and of the coronavirus, as well as doing a lot of writing on elections. So Latin America is in an election season right now. We'll talk about—
And that's why we're here tonight.
Yeah, Nicaragua, Honduras, Chile is about to elect a president, or at least have a first round. Argentina has a midterm. Venezuela's holding elections. So it's been a lot of writing about the polls.
You mentioned the vaccine rollout and the COVID-19 situation throughout the region. When you talk to people in the United States, or if you get opportunity to talk to people in other parts of the world, whether Europe or Asia, are they aware of the seriousness of the COVID-19 situation in the region that you look at, or does that come as a surprise to them? Because obviously we hear so much news more about China, Japan received a lot of attention, especially because of the Olympics. Obviously, Western Europe, with its on-again, off-again lockdowns, received a lot of attention. But are people around the world aware of the situation for COVID-19 in South America?
South America captured a lot of international attention at the onset of the pandemic, particularly around these sort of horrific scenes in Latin American cities, in places like Peru and Ecuador, where they were really struggling with the first wave of infections. I think that it faded from international view from a bit, though Brazil, where the virus was particularly bad, especially when the variants started to emerge, became this example of COVID mismanagement. People were really fixated on its president, Jair Bolsonaro, who won't get vaccinated, was kind of a skeptic of any public health measures. But I'll say now the underreported story may be that many countries in Latin America are some of the top vaccinators in the world. The continent's been pretty steady in its vaccination once it got supply. So I think there should be a little bit more international attention to how countries like Chile, Uruguay, even Brazil, which just surpassed the United States in total percentage vaccinated, have sort of steadily worked through their strong vaccine rollout infrastructure.
Now, is there, I hate to use the word secret or some kind of magic, is there some reasons why they're successful with that? And I'm thinking more from the perspective of some of these countries are obviously very large. There are people who are not in urban areas. They're hard to reach. What's the reasons for this high vaccination rate from a logistics perspective?
It's often because these countries have spectacular childhood vaccine distribution systems that pre-existed before the pandemic. Brazil is kind of a quintessential example of a country that for decades has been great at vaccinating, especially these hard to reach areas. And you see some really funny and intriguing innovations. So I saw a video the other day of an ice cream truck that was refrigerating vaccines, driving down a dirt road in deep interior Brazil, giving out vaccines. You also have very, very low levels of vaccine skepticism in countries like Uruguay, Chile, Brazil, really the whole region, which is partially related to the fact that they have this history of vaccination. And it's also partially because they don't have a history of vaccine skepticism as we do in the United States.
And who tends to administer the vaccines? Is it nurses as opposed to doctors, or doctors as opposed to nurses, pharmacists like we have in the United States, for example?
I think it's mostly nurses. I'm not exactly sure on that, but the mobilization was really rapid in some of these countries.
And from the, you mentioned some of the companies that are members of the council. What are the issues that they are interested in? When they come to the council for analysis, what are people asking about? Is it just trade and economic issues? Is it COVID-19? Is it crime? Is it the elections, relations with the US, relations with China? What's the demand for information right now with regard to Latin America?
I think you touched on a lot of the issues our members deeply care about. They tend to really care about macroeconomics and also elections. Elections is when people tend to turn to these countries and they're really looking for what to expect from these new leaders. I'll say that US-China relations in Latin America are another big topic that our members care about. I would say that our members tend to care the most about the big juggernaut countries in Latin America, those with a large business footprint. So you're talking about Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile. Countries that we'll talk about later, like Central America, are a little bit harder to get member attention towards, but certainly on issues like trade and security, there is deep interest.
Well, let's get into those elections. Let's talk about Nicaragua, which had its election on November 7th. First, help us understand, why was that election held on November 7th? Was that just the natural end of the term of the National Assembly and the president, or was there some other factor why that was the date of the election?
That was the expected date of the election. That was the routine schedule for it. What people would say is that the date of the election is not quite when that election got settled, because there was a lot that happened in the pre-electoral environment in the months of June and July that predetermined that result.
Yeah, we'll get into some of those controversies, but just putting those controversies aside, something I'm curious about is President Ortega's Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN. They seem to have some electoral success in the last several election cycles. So just putting aside for a second integrity, voter election integrity issues, what is it about the FSLN that still attracts support from a certain segment of society?
The FSLN is a revolutionary party. It dates back to the Nicaraguan Civil War in the 1970s. And parties like that tend to have deep, passionate roots in society. So people who identify as Sandinistas, people who valorize Daniel Ortega, tend to be deeply embedded in the ideology and in the ground life of that party. We're talking about a party that's been around for decades. So you can imagine that at the most local level, the neighborhood level, there are strong webs of support. So there's a lot of cult of personality, I would say, around Daniel Ortega that still exists. But I would also temper that by saying that the FSLN party has seen a lot of splintering in the past couple decades. There's been a lot of figures that were once closely associated and devoted to the FSLN either leave the party, critique the party, or become exiled.
So they're a revolutionary party, and they've been around for a while. There's a cult of personality. But what are their actual policies, whether on economic or trade issues, social policies? What do they actually push? I mean, what's their platform?
There have been many lives of Daniel Ortega, and I'm going to use Daniel Ortega as a bit of a proxy for the party here because it's so closely associated with him. This is a revolutionary party of the left, right? This classic Latin American left. It's about returning power to the people. It's about taking off the mantle of imperialism. It's about eschewing the business elites. So Daniel Ortega for a while was this really classic Latin American leftist who was integral to this fabric of leftism throughout Latin America. So you might also think of leaders like Hugo Chavez or of the Castros in Cuba. Love to be aligned with them. Something curious happened about 10 years ago. Ortega became a lot more business friendly. He started to cultivate relationships with the business class. He was doing things like putting these interesting free trade areas in Nicaragua. And you saw pretty strong business growth in Nicaragua. That era, that life of Daniel Ortega ended in 2018 when there was this large scale protest in Nicaragua that we can talk about. Subsequently, his policies have been a little bit less clear. Something to know about Daniel Ortega is that he disappears for large swaths of time for reasons that are unknown, and that his wife, Rosario Murillo, who's also the first lady, kind of rules in his absentia. And so since 2018, he's been a little absent. Of course, coronavirus really battered the country. So a new direction for the FSLN and the Ortegas has been not quite crystallized yet. I will say that they spent a lot of time in 2020 focused on laws around electoral reforms and around silencing opposition in the country.
Is there any substantive achievement besides the politics and trying to repress an opposition that was enthusiastic about replacing him? But do they have any substantive achievements over the past few years that they were trying to sell voters? More hospitals, more roads? Did they do anything other than just exert power?
Absolutely. If I was a Sandinista, I'd probably point to things like a reduction of poverty in Nicaragua. As I mentioned, they had pretty ferocious business growth in the 2010s. And I think another thing the Sandinistas might point to is the fact that aside from Costa Rica, Nicaragua is the safest country in Central America. It has not seen the kind of problems with gangs and violence that other countries in the region have. You mentioned roads and buildings. You know, the FSLN, when you get a party that's that institutionalized in government, they often do a lot of infrastructure projects and a lot of on-the-ground handouts as the center of their public policy. It's brilliant for credit claiming. So when I've been in Nicaragua, you see that party logo everywhere. I came back with so many clothes, backpacks, little trinkets that the FSLN will give to citizens. So I think they would point to the very visible government policies that they've handed to the people.
And what about the main opposition, Constitutionalist Liberal Party? What do they stand for?
You know, I'd be careful calling them the main opposition party. They're a little bit of a tricky entity. They have been around for a bit. They've held the presidency before with a man named Arnaldo Alemán, and he was really the center of the life of that party. In the past, they've entered various pacts with the FSLN, so power sharing agreements or policy sharing agreements. I think most Nicaraguans would say that any political party that still exists in Nicaragua that hasn't been disqualified is skeptical and is likely aligned with the FSLN. Ideologically, I think they would say they're center-right, and they will continue to be the second biggest force in the National Assembly, though I would be surprised if they put up any substantial opposition or no votes in this session.
You just mentioned the voter perceptions of the Constitutionalist Liberal Party. What are voters looking at? I mean, for example, let's start off with, do the voters really follow politics closely in Nicaragua?
I think yes, but I'm going to temper these answers by saying that Nicaragua is a country that lacks a domestic free press. Ortega has shut down most of the newspapers. All the TV stations in the country are owned by his children. And Nicaraguans have to be very careful when talking to international figures because there are laws around public dissent. So it's sometimes hard to know for sure. I would say that in my experience when I was there, it is hard for politics to not be integral to the fabric of your life when you live in a place like Nicaragua. I mean, the political environment is suffocating. You also have a government that's very involved in the daily lives of people. You have a country that's struggling. The economy is not doing well. It's got the lowest COVID vaccination rate in Latin America, aside from Haiti. It had a pretty brutal coronavirus pandemic. So I would say that people are certainly paying attention to politics, but more trying to figure out how to navigate this strange political environment than really
separate from the politics, was there specific issues that voters cared about in the run-up to this election?
Those that I talked to, I think COVID vaccination was a pretty big deal. And I think just the desire for political pluralism. They really want more options.
I read that the voting age in Nicaragua is 16. Is that accurate?
I think it is, yes.
And do teenagers actively engage? Do they follow the issues, or do they turn out to vote?
I'm not exactly sure. I haven't talked to any Nicaraguan teens in a bit, but I think they likely are. Though I'll just say regionally, we're seeing a big disenchantment with democracy and politics generally from youth voters. They have some of the lowest rates of participation, which is not so uncommon worldwide. But what is really concerning is that they have low levels of faith in democratic systems. And I can imagine that would only be intensified in a place like Nicaragua, where a 16-year-old would never have experienced some of the more free and fair elections that happened closer to the turn of the millennium.
Well, let's talk about the controversies during this election cycle. Government arrested a lot of opposition figures over the course of 2020, including potential presidential candidates. What happened? How did the government justify that?
There are two laws that the government mainly leveraged, both of which were passed either at the end of 2020 or at the beginning of 2021. One law is called the traitor law, essentially, and it gives the government leverage to persecute anyone who is seen as a traitor to the Nicaraguan government. Of course, the phrasing there is pretty vague, and it gives them wide latitude to declare anyone critical of the Sandinista project of Ortega as a traitor. So that was likely the source of some of the arrests. The other piece of legislation was called the Foreign Agents Law, and that deemed any organization that received any sort of foreign funding as a foreign agent. And that allowed them to target human rights groups, media groups. So one of the first big arrests was of Cristina Chamorro, who's the daughter of a former president. And that was because of that law. She ran like a human rights watchdog group and they raided the office. These laws exist and they were likely used. But I will say that the arrests never went to any sort of trial. There were never any sort of warrants. So the government is doing what it wants, even though there is now a legal patchwork in place that it would say justifies its action.
Did these arrests result in the public coming back into the streets and protesting?
Not from what we saw, but again, emphasizing that the press freedom isn't great there. People are really worried about being arrested themselves if they speak out. There was a large outcry internationally. The country that houses most of the Nicaraguans in exile is Costa Rica, and there was a lot of protesting.
What about backing up criticism with action, though? I know there's been some news in recent days as well from the United States with regard to sanctions or potential sanctions. But help us understand the response at a government level, whether from neighboring countries or countries further away, but that still have an interest in democracy and rule of law in Nicaragua.
The international community has really been watching all of this electoral drama unfold, considering the tools at its disposal, but I think a little bit unsure of what it can do as it watches a country fully merge into a dictatorship. You mentioned that the US has sanctions. They do. We've had them for a while. They just got increased, and the Senate passed something called the Renacer Act, which helped them increase the sanctions. So you see things like members of the Ortega regime are unable to travel internationally. It's hard for them to access bank accounts. The US also has more generalized sanctions that sadly people would say hurt the people more than the regime. The EU also has sanctions. You've seen a lot of countries call out the election as a sham, call out the election when these arrests happened. The chief of the Organization of American States said it was the worst possible election when all these opposition figures were arrested. The appetite for more action, it's a little bit unclear what else could be done. And here in the United States, there's a real consciousness of the history of intervention in the country, that overstepping could actually further entrench Ortega and the Sandinistas. One area that I think could be a potential for more action is actually within Central America. If Central America spoke with a clearer, more coherent voice, I think it would be effective. Countries like Panama and Costa Rica have been highly critical of the election. Countries like Honduras, right before the election, the president of Honduras and the president of Nicaragua had this brotherhood summit. So there is complicity to encouragement of the Ortega regime.
You mentioned countries in Central America, maybe they could do more. What would be the platform to do that? Would it be on a unilateral basis, or one of the multilateral organizations would be the right platform, or the United Nations would be the right platform? What's the method that they would actually go about, whether statements or hopefully more than statements, but actual action?
There's a couple platforms they might look at. The Organization of American States, which is sort of like the UN, but just for the Western Hemisphere, would be an interesting place to start. There's a motion to remove Nicaragua from the body because it is violating the Interdemocratic Charter, and strong Central American support could potentially push that through. Central America might look to things like free trade. Nicaragua is in CAFTA DR, which is this Central America US trade zone that people have been reticent to touch because it would only further really weaken the Nicaraguan economy. But beyond any of these groups, I just think there's a lack of regional leadership. There's not a figure or a group of figures who can stand up and speak to Ortega or visit Ortega. And we could talk about how much power something like that would actually have, but I do think that it would be a strong statement coming from Nicaragua's neighbors rather than countries that Ortega is dismissive of as meddling superpowers.
How much is the experience with Venezuela relevant to how this is playing out, especially with these other countries or the United States or Western Europe, right? They've tried to change the conditions or the regime in Venezuela, didn't recognize the government, recognized the opposition as the president or the legitimate president. But ultimately, the facts on the ground, at least as of now, several years later, still haven't changed. Is this relevant to how countries are approaching the situation in Nicaragua?
I think it's extremely relevant. I think it's highly on the mind of anybody operating in this area that to witness a country free fall democratically, economically, and to witness a country generate such a migration crisis that has really destabilized the region. I mean, Venezuela's neighbors have had to accept millions of refugees. That's got to be something that all countries, especially in Central America, are thinking about. But I think the lesson a lot of people took from Venezuela is the paucity of effective tools to encourage democracy. And the international community tried a lot to right the course of Venezuela. They tried supporting these opposition regimes. They tried supporting the de facto government of Juan Guaido. And I think ultimately they have still struggled to find actual tools that can cause change. So I think that these same problems are reemerging in Nicaragua. And just quickly on the migration thing, we're seeing a lot of Nicaraguans go to the Honduran border to get vaccines. So already there's starting to be a bit of a spillover effect of government mismanagement in Nicaragua.
Let's talk about Taiwan and the election in Nicaragua. Did Taiwan have any role? Was it partial to one side or the other? Was it just a silent observer? Was it vocal about the arrests and promoting a free and fair election? What was Taiwan's role in this election?
I didn't personally see any criticism from Taiwan of what happened before the election. I think Taiwan is obviously very cautious of maintaining this relationship it has with Nicaragua, which puts it in a really tough place because Taiwan is, of course, a country that really values democracy. I think the alliance between Taiwan and Nicaragua is a little curious. I don't think they're the most natural allies, though it's remained pretty strong. You know, there was efforts over the past decade for China to exert influence in Nicaragua. Things like a proposed canal that China and Russia wanted to build through Nicaragua were shelved. So it seems like for the time being, the Nicaraguan-Taiwanese relationship will remain strong. I don't see any reason for it to fade in the next couple of years, but I think certainly it was a challenging electoral environment for Taiwan to witness.
Well, help us understand though, because Ortega being this leftist revolutionary, and maybe there's some economic benefit. It was a legacy relationship when he came back into power, so it had been established by his predecessors. But what is the motivation for him to maintain this rather than establish relations with his leftist, left of center political brethren, the Communist Party of China?
Yeah, you know, when you think about it, right, it would be like ideologically a little bit more of a natural fit, maybe a more natural fit in thoughts on governance. Of course, Taiwan provides all of its allies in Latin America and the Caribbean with aid. I think the aid budget in 2019 for internationally was like 300 million, but you know that also pales in comparison to what China can offer. I find sometimes the Taiwanese relationships in Latin America a bit hard to understand, but where I find the most understanding is thinking about them interpersonally, which is to say that a lot of these leaders have strong personal relationships with Taiwan. Taiwan visits a lot, they've been to Taiwan, and so it seems like there's an interest in preserving this friendship. But yeah, we can talk about this later maybe with Honduras, but there was an interesting moment for vaccine diplomacy where I was curious to see if there was going to be some breaking of alliances with Taiwan.
I mean, sometimes here in Taiwan, there's a view that China could change the Nicaragua relationship whenever it either puts pressure or uses some other method to inform or instruct Ortega to make that switch. Is it not as simple as that? Is the personal relationship still very relevant to him rather than just China coming in and saying, now's the time to make this switch and this is the aid package that we'll provide?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit hard to know exactly what's going on behind the scenes. Another way to think about it maybe is Ortega is very conscious of foreign interference in his country. So perhaps things like the canal project where foreign countries were trying to cut a literal moat through his country rubbed him the wrong way. But, you know, he is not a very transparent figure. And so while I think he probably would recognize that economically recognizing China would give him a lot of benefits, there's something there that's holding him steady with Taiwan. I'll say too, he's a leader who really likes stasis. He's not going for those big transformative public policies. He's kind of puttering along right now. And that could also be a reason for it.
How does the public in Nicaragua feel about Taiwan? Are they aware that the aid comes from Taiwan specifically, or is it just it's foreign aid from one more donor and aid is given by a number of donors? Do they know the difference between Taiwan and China, for example? It will help us understand a bit to the extent that you're familiar with public sentiment towards Taiwan.
If you go to Managua and a lot of Nicaragua, you see flags of other countries all over the place, on buses, on infrastructure projects. I saw Russian flags, I saw Taiwanese flags, I saw Costa Rican flags. So I think that if people know the Taiwanese flag, they likely are aware of some of the projects that are there. But I will say too that Nicaraguans I've talked to aren't thinking particularly strongly about Taiwan. This is a country where people are struggling to get by and are struggling to live in a oppressive political environment. So there's likely an awareness of Taiwan because of the history of the relationship, but I don't think anyone is, for example, going to the polls like Taiwan is my number one issue.
Let's move on to Honduras.
Yeah. Election
coming on November 28th for president and the National Congress. So very similar to Nicaragua, which also had a president, and it's what they call the National Assembly. Is this an election of right versus left? The parties, the ruling party has Nasri Aspura, National Party, left of center, Ms. Castro from what's now a coalition of parties called Libre. Is it just a question of right versus left, or is it some other distinction between the two sides?
There are certainly other distinctions. Right versus left, I think you could say the National Party, which is nominated Nasri Tito, he goes by Tito Asfura, is more aligned with the right, and Xiomara Castro of Libre is more aligned with the left. That's certainly true. But I would say that this election is a bit more of a referendum on the National Party, which has been in power for 12 years. And the lines that are drawn in Nicaraguan politics right now really derive from two formative events that happened in the country's politics. So the first was in 2009, and this is maybe the most important one, where this man named Manuel Zelaya was the president. He's more from the left. Xiomara Castro is his wife. He was in power, and he started to talk about doing a referendum to enable re-election, because Honduras at the time did not have presidential re-election. And essentially there was a coup d'etat where he was removed and the National Party took power. This was hugely controversial. It garnered a lot of international interest, and it set up this real fracture between the sides that supported Zelaya and the sides that supported the National Party and Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's now the president, who eventually took over. So that was an event that created this cleavage. That cleavage was further developed in 2017, where there was an election where Juan Orlando Hernandez did run for re-election, which was a little funky, and then won by an extremely small margin, and it was called fraudulent by every international observer. There was a large amount of violence. So that's kind of the cleavage people are thinking of. The National Party has been in power 12 years. They've been running the country. So the question is, do people want a continuation of that? Do people want change? And change here would be represented by Xiomara Castro, who's become the flag bearer for the other side.
Other than just simply change, though, what's on the minds of the voters in Honduras? Similar to the issues in Nicaragua. Is it COVID? Is it economic development? Something else?
Honduras is a country that's in a really tough place right now. You had, even before coronavirus, high levels of poverty, high levels of insecurity. It's a country that has a lot of gang violence and a lot of petty violence. Then what you had in 2020 was this noxious combination of a pandemic, which of course impacted every country, and I think especially poor countries sometimes more. You had 2 hurricanes that hit virtually in the span of a week. So Hurricane Eta and Hurricane Iota. And so Honduras is in this place where people lost everything in these events. They're really struggling. Poverty is extremely high in the country. And you have extremely high levels of distrust. 9 out of 10 Hondurans said in a poll I read that they thought their country was on the wrong track. So the issues people are thinking of are those I mentioned: security, poverty, recovery, COVID. But they're also this question you get in a country with high migration rates like Honduras, which is it time to leave? Can this election do anything to right the course of my country? Or do I just not have a future here because these problems are so intractable?
There were protests in 2019 as well. So even though the election in 2017 was controversial, then there were large protests in 2019. What were the protests in 2019 about?
It was about the government management of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who has been in charge now for quite some time. And it was just what you tend to see in Central America and much of Latin America is protests that explode because of some specific issue, but have sort of been building for a while. So I think it was actually over security. I might be wrong about this one, but it was likely a reaction to a lot of pent-up frustration within the Honduran political environment.
Oh, you've shared with us a number of things that make it sound pretty obvious. It's not going so well in Honduras. Well, what's the appeal for the National Party then? Why would voters be inclined to give them another chance to continue their governance?
The National Party is highly bureaucratized because they've been in power for 12 years. So many organs of the Honduran government have been controlled completely by the National Party. That gives you a lot of power to give people goods and resources. So that could be a factor. People are thinking, I got a stove for my home and it came from the National Party. They're a more business-friendly party, right? So some in Nicaragua or some in Honduras might think that if Castro wins, there'll be an awful environment for business, an awful environment for foreign investment. The National Party, businesses trust them. They know what they're dealing with. Another factor for the National Party is that they have a good candidate here. So Nasri Tito Asfura, he is a very popular mayor of Tegucigalpa, which is the capital. He's charismatic. He wears like workman clothes every day, and he has done a whole spate of infrastructure projects in Tegucigalpa. Most leaders acknowledge that he's the most popular, well-liked politician in the country. And he's the only one of the 3 who has the 3 major candidates, who has a positive favorability rating. One little fun anecdote is he calls himself Papi a la Orden, so like dad of order. And he calls himself Papi in a lot of contexts to give off this fatherly image. So there's a chance that though people don't like the National Party, they might like Asfura much more than they like Castro or the 3rd candidate whose last name is Rosenthal.
It seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like Libre Castro was behind earlier, but then she sort of went ahead in the polls, but now it seems too close to call. Is that a fair description?
That is a fair description. There was a major development in October where there were sort of 2 candidates who were standard bearers of the opposition. You had Xiomara Castro, and you had this man named Salvador Nasralla, who was a sportscaster and then became a politician who's this anti-corruption crusader. He was the candidate who actually narrowly lost back in 2017, though a lot of people would say that he likely won. And the 2 of them were both running. Back in 2017, Castro was actually Nasralla's vice presidential nominee. So they have a history together. Anyway, Nasralla decided to drop out and endorse Castro. He was polling around 15%, and most of that went to Castro. So you saw her starting to poll around the low 30s. Asfura is polling around the low 20s. I'll say though, polls in Honduras, there aren't many that are extremely reliable, and polling stopped on Sunday. So there weren't many polls that were able to talk to citizens after Nasralla dropped out. So we're flying a little blind here with what's happening between these 2 figures, but I would be surprised if it wasn't one of the two of them. And it's a one round. So whoever gets the most votes, they're the president.
What would you expect from the next president as far as what seems to be the main issue that prompts migration, which is the crime issue? What kind of public safety policies would you expect?
The crime issue is really intense in Honduras. You have a lot of gang activity. It is driving migration. There's a lot of narco trafficking. The way that Juan Orlando Hernandez has tackled it is by really focusing on strengthening and institutionalizing the Honduran security forces. So he has added more officers, better training, more resources. It's resulted in this interesting figure where he claims that over the past 5-8 years, there's been a 94% drop in homicides. We could debate that figure, but crime is still a massive problem in this country. You know, there might be less homicides, but there's a lot of existing criminal activity. What have the major candidates proposed? Asfura has proposed really continuing with a JOH, as people call him, the president's policies, so strengthening the military. He's talked a little bit about root causes, which is to say what is, driving people to criminal enterprises, what is creating conditions that criminal enterprises thrive in. So he's talked about a big jobs program, a big youth jobs program, and that would certainly help. Castro is more focused on the root causes, I think. She has spoken about, developing economic situations for poor Hondurans, job creation again, empowerment of women. A big question here is how either will cooperate with the United States, who obviously has a vested interest in security in Honduras. It's probably a good time to mention that Juan Orlando Hernandez, the president, is believed by some to be a narco trafficker himself. And there's a couple cases in US courts that have produced evidence that very strongly suggests that he's involved in the narco trafficking trade. His brother was indicted. So a big question is what's going to happen with that case, and how would either candidate cooperate or stave off United States efforts to, say, extradite an ex-president, which would be a pretty dramatic development.
Notwithstanding that, though, do you expect the U.S., the Biden administration, to work with whoever wins the election?
I do expect that. And the United States doesn't have so much of a choice here. They are committed to improving conditions in what's known as the Northern Triangle region, which is Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Kamala Harris made it a pretty big centerpiece of her time as vice president. It was like one of the first issues that Biden handed over to her. But the United States is in a tricky position here because the Biden-Harris strategy in Central America is really focused on these root causes, right? How can we develop the economy, improve quality of life for people so that they won't consider migrating or joining a criminal enterprise? But they need cooperative leaders to some extent. They can only work with the business sector so much. And the leader that they really put their faith in was the president of Guatemala, a man named Alejandro Giammattei. And they thought that he was maybe going to be their champion in the area. And then he pretty quickly rebuked them and did this dramatic event of dismissing this anti-corruption prosecutor that the United States really liked, which was seen as sort of an affront to the United States. So I think the United States knows it has to stay active in the region. But the question is, would Asfura, would Castro be a champion and a partner for the United States? It remains to be seen. It's hard to tell.
Well, speaking of partnerships, there's that Honduras-Taiwan partnership, which yes. Castro has fairly clearly said she will end if she is elected, that she will de-recognize the Republic of China and recognize the People's Republic of China. If she does win the election, do you expect her to carry that out?
I'm not exactly sure. She made that statement a couple months back. It's a dramatic statement, right? And it produced a strong reaction. You saw a lot of efforts from Taiwan to reach out and talk to her team, to talk to figures out the country. Juan Orlando Hernandez was in Taiwan just a couple days ago. So the reaction was big. Interestingly, I haven't heard that rhetoric from her subsequently. It's not as though she is giving big speeches around the country about aligning with China. So there's a chance that, she realized maybe that she misspoke, or the issue is of lower priority for her now. Something that's intriguing about Castro is that I think she's very cognizant of not scaring off the international community or the business community with too much change. People are quick to categorize her as this Castro-aligned figure. Her husband had somewhat of a relationship with him, or sorry, not Castro, Chavez, this Chavez or Castro-aligned figure. So she really does not want to cultivate that image. Also, I think she's aware from previous elections that she cannot scare off the business community or the electoral environment too much. If people truly think she would be a threat to the state generally, I think we might see things like electoral fraud, which would be unfortunate. So I think in Castro's campaign, she's trying to figure out how to present her ideas for government, which are definitely more socialist, without seeing herself as like a sea change for the country that would get people nervous. For me, a switch from Taiwan to China would be that kind of sea change that I think would make business leaders in the international community a little bit more nervous about her. So that to me could also speak to why she's demurred on this issue for more kitchen table issues.
So the business community, are they not in favor of a switch to China? They don't see any greater economic opportunity if that switch is made?
I think they likely do, but we didn't see them applaud her for making this statement. I mean, they stayed pretty silent on it, which could be because, they have a good relationship with the National Party, who is sticking with Taiwan, or it could be because their businesses are structured and integrated with Taiwan. But it certainly wasn't something that the business community liked her for doing.
What about the public? We talked a little bit about Nicaraguan public and how they view Taiwan, if they're aware of Taiwan. What about in Honduras?
I think that the Honduran public is aware of the issue. Again, when you have things like natural disaster devastation and deep levels of poverty, I think any issue of foreign affairs isn't taking such high precedence. But one way that the people may have been aware in Honduras about the impact of the relationship with Taiwan was earlier during the pandemic. There was a concern throughout Central America that countries aligned with Taiwan were not getting access to Chinese vaccines, which was largely true. And Honduras had an interesting situation where Juan Orlando Hernandez, the president, actually started talking about establishing a trade office with China in the country. And many saw it as a move to get some sort of vaccine deal or maybe a donation of supplies. So if people were following vaccine news, they likely were following that. And they likely noticed that they did not end up getting any Chinese vaccines, that really the US swooped in for Honduras to provide vaccines.
If Castro wins, do you expect the US to put pressure on her not to make a switch?
I do expect that, yes. I think that they would likely want Honduras to stay with Taiwan.
And if Nasri wins, is there any potential for a surprise? He becomes the Nixon type who suddenly makes that switch and recognizes the PRC, or do you see that as unlikely?
If he's going to call himself the father of order, I don't think he could be making those kinds of big switches. I haven't seen any evidence that would suggest that the National Party is eyeing a diplomatic switch. It truly does seem like what occurred with the potential trade office was a blip on the radar. But for a lot of these leaders, economic growth is the thing that could get them the most popularity immediately. Like, this is a country that really needs business and jobs. So there's a chance that if he thinks China can bring in a ton of new business, he would go for it. But it seemed like the National Party is pretty firmly aligned and comfortable with Taiwan.
Very quickly, let's talk about some of those other relationships that Taiwan has in the region. Belize, Guatemala, Paraguay. Anything Taiwan needs to worry about there as far as a potential derecognition?
There was some concern, generally, as I mentioned. I would say this is like summer of 2021 when you started to see the big vaccine rollouts, that Again, Taiwan wasn't able to aid its allies as China was in the provision of medical supplies and vaccines. I will say that Taiwan did provide a lot of great medical resources to its partners. So it was not at all as if they abandoned them at all. It really was just that they didn't have access to vaccines as China did. And you saw these little incidents of, I mentioned Honduras with the trade office. Paraguay had a moment where the president had a conversation with China's foreign minister, and then China donated vaccines directly to Paraguay's soccer league. Because there was this big soccer tournament in South America. The international and domestic outcry to that was pretty swift, actually. The United States basically told Paraguay, stick with Taiwan, stick with them. There was, I want to say, a motion in the Paraguayan legislature to consider switching relations, and it was shut down pretty quickly. Going back to this notion, I think that these Paraguayan officials and legislators have a strong relationship with Taiwan. They have appreciated the aid that Taiwan has provided. In the case of Paraguay, the president's father had a really strong relationship with Taiwan. So there's this interesting notion of familial continuity. So I'll say that I think Paraguay was the country people were most concerned about in this little vaccine panic. But all of the countries you mentioned are still struggling with vaccine rollout, and that's concerning. Guatemala is only at about 16% fully vaccinated. Honduras is about 30%. Paraguay is perhaps the lowest in South America, aside from Venezuela, which is sometimes hard to track. So this is all to say that a lot of countries in Latin America did use Chinese vaccines, and these countries were not able to. The flip side is that some of those countries, I think, now are not so happy that they use Chinese vaccines, because those vaccines were seen as less effective, and the United States is not allowing people to travel within our borders who received certain Chinese vaccines. So I think that citizens perhaps are happy there wasn't a Chinese alignment. And in the case of all those countries, the United States stepped in and donated a large amount of vaccines. So I think there is a notion that a little patience got the vaccines they needed, and they didn't end up needing to do this diplomatic realignment with Taiwan.
Well, we're almost out of time, so a couple of quick questions. First, for people who don't read Spanish or Portuguese, what do you recommend as really good news sources about the region?
So a lot of great Central American news sources have English language sections. For Nicaragua, I would say your best source is going to be Confidencial, and they have an English language section. So that's confidential, but in Spanish, Confidencial. For Honduras, there's this great English media source called Contra Corriente. I could send maybe this afterwards. And another great Spanish language source with an English language section is El Faro, which is actually Salvadoran. It's from El Salvador, but it has a great English language section. Another recommendation I have is there are certain people on Twitter who are really strong freelance journalists in the region. So Tim Rogers is such a strong source on Nicaragua. Someone like Jeff Ernst would be really good for Honduras as well.
And before we go, any final observations on the region or Taiwan in the region that you'd like to share?
I'll just say that I think it's a little bit of a inflection point for the region in terms of people's faith in democracy. I think people admitted after this Nicaraguan election that it is fully a dictatorship. I think if Honduras doesn't see a successful, trusted election, it will have its democratic credentials questioned, and a lot of Hondurans will lose faith in it. So I think for a country like Taiwan, that's a big concern. They want to make sure that their allies have functioning democratic systems. And so I think it's a real moment for people to reflect on, like, what are the conditions that are making it so challenging for these countries to sustain democracy? But I'm hoping for the best for Honduras.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, Chase.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the audience for tuning in. It's been a great conversation.
You've been watching Ross Night, hosted by the Asia Pacific Youth Association and co-sponsored by Charity Video and Formosa Correspondence Club. Thank you.